Hey guys, Ryan Gill here with Hunt Primitive, where we entertain, educate, and inspire. On this channel, we do a lot of primitive build or hunting videos, just like this one, so if it's your first time, do please consider subscribing. The video today is for people that are really serious about primitive strings, specifically sinew strings, but I will talk in great depth about plant fiber as well. So I expect very few people to really watch this video unless you are kind of like mind screwed over primitive strings and you absolutely love being contextual, and primitive strings are the next piece of the puzzle for your primitive gear set, and you must know how to make the best primitive strings possible for your own hunting set. That's what this video is for. I am going to build a sinew string while I talk to you, and this is probably going to be the most in-depth conversation on primitive strings that you're probably going to get anywhere outside of my book. Hold on, I do have a copy here. I hate to try to advertise to you guys because that never really works out really well, and it has a lot less to do with selling copies of the book to make money. I want you to get it so you have the knowledge, and of course there's a lot more in this book than just primitive string stuff. This is 428 pages of exactly what the title says, the secrets and science of primitive archery. There is so much good information in here. If you don't have it, please get it. And you can get it at huntprimitive.com, and I'll drop a link down in the description. If you do have it, feel free to drop a comment what you think about the book, what your favorite chapter is, anything you want to say about it. I would appreciate it. So outside of the book that has a phenomenal amount of information on primitive strings, this is probably going to be the most conclusive video that you could probably ask for in regards to primitive strings. Okay, so what we're going to be building today is a sinew string out of whitetail deer backstrap sinew, and this is the backstraps from 2 mature whitetail deer. I do recommend using from mature deer. You can build bowstrings from young deer. However, the backstrap sinew pieces from a mature deer are not only going to be a little bit bigger, but they're going to be a little bit more robust. Now, typically I run anywhere from, I would say 3 to 6, but that's on a shorter string, so we're going to call 4 to 6 strips of backstrap sinew, and I don't use necessarily like the little short stuff. Once I start getting short like this, I don't really use that anymore. What I do is I set this aside for working on arrows or to boil down into a hide or a sinew glue, which will be a different video for a different day. So make sure that you are following along, subscribe to the channel, because that video is not done yet, and that's going to be a really good one. You're going to want to watch that one. What I focus on is just using the longest fibers, and so anything that size and up is good. Once we start getting down to this size, which, you know, maybe we start talking, there's a little bit here that's still pretty good, maybe 10 inches long. I'll save those and use these. Once we start getting below 8-9 inches, I'm typically not going to use this for the bowstring, and the reason is because when you'll see later when we fold it over to twist these in, we then only have 4 inches of bite before we're adding new pieces. And this leads into the next thing that I really want to talk about, and that is there's enough sinew in one adult normal sized whitetail deer. You can make a bowstring from a single deer's worth of sinew. But that being said, you end up with a lot of short pieces and a lot of very short splices, and it doesn't make the best string that you can possibly make. Is it possible to do it? Absolutely. But you're also going to be beating your head against the wall with a lot of really short pieces of leg sinew, and you're constantly going to be lapping them over trying to make the string longer, and you're going to be splicing over and over and over again. So the best way to combat that is wait till you have 2 adult deer and just use their backstrap sinews, and that should be 4 for most primitive strings, unless you're talking super heavyweight bows. But 4 backstrap pieces should be more than sufficient if you kind of know what you're doing. You'll probably end up using more sinew if you're not really good at string making right away. So it might not hurt to have 5 or 6 on hand just in case till you get your sizing figured out, because it all just takes practice. So as you'll see, the string is going to be a lot thicker while we're making it than compared to when it's stretched and it dries and it shrinks down. So that's an interesting game to play that we'll talk about later. Okay, now there's a ton more stuff that I want to discuss with you, but I'm going to do it kind of while I work. So you're going to be able to see me make the string, and it'll be instructional, and I'll tell you what I'm doing on important points, and then otherwise what I'll be doing is just building the string, and you can watch me while I'm telling you a lot of these other really important things about primitive strings that you're going to want to know. But to really start it off, what I'm going to do is, a lot of times on the backs of these there's this papery kind of membrane. Don't worry about that, just kind of rip that off. And you don't have to rip it off super clean. See what I mean? Here's this papery membrane. But I do try to get rid of some of it, and it doesn't have to come off perfect, because when you separate the fibers, that'll come off a little bit easier. And we're going to go ahead and just discard that stuff. We'll clean that up later. Now, a lot of people, when they process sinew, I've seen they lay it down on a rock and then they smash it with another rock, and then it gets all fluffy, and that makes a nice looking sinew. And I'm not saying that you can't do that, but I'm saying I do not do that, and it's for one very specific reason, and that is when you start bashing the sinew, all it does is start to damage the fibers. Now, when it comes to taking in the round leg sinew that is like the size of your finger, and you need to actually bash that up to get it to separate. Okay, but the back sinew, once you process this out, and if you don't know how to process this out, there is a video on my channel. Just look up Hunt Primitive Sinew, processing sinew, and that video should come up to get you to this point. But I leave it in this whole state, and then I take my fingernail and I just pull pieces off. And this is the most efficient way possible. There's no sense in beating this stuff up and weakening the fibers by bashing it with a rock. And you can pull strands off, and it's even hard to tell you what thickness. I'm not going to go for like the thinnest stuff possible. Like that's a really, really thin one. You'll drive yourself nuts doing that. That's like really fine, like a thread. But if you take a big chunk off, you'll see that it's kind of wide and flat. And if it's noticeably flat, I split that again, because what I really want is just a piece that's a little bit wider than it is thick. And let's just, for the fun of say so, call it a 1/16 of an inch, or 1 to 2 millimeters. And if you have some thicker ones, that's okay too. And if you get some really thin ones, don't throw them away, just save them. But you'll get an idea for what you're looking for, and hopefully you can kind of see the size that I'm shooting for here. So we're going to split all of these out now, or at least say let's split out 3 or 4, because we can always wet up more and add more later. But we would like to have a little bit more on standby than we need, because we don't really want to stretch and dry this string until it's completely twisted together. So I'm going to go ahead and pull the rest of this sinew apart, and when I'm done doing that, then we'll get on to actually twisting it. Okay, so I got all of that sinew split up, and again, I still have more if I need to add to it. At least I have some on standby, but this is probably enough for the relatively short bowstring that we're going to make. And I don't want to get this stuff super supple like I would for wrapping arrowheads or fletching or something like that, but I definitely want to wet this down. And I'll explain why you don't want it super soggy later, but for the most part I'm just going to roll it up and then stick it down in just a container of cool water. Now if it does happen to be particularly greasy, then it's not going to hurt to just take a little bit of Dawn dish soap, put it in there, let it kind of soak a little bit, and wash it up. But for the most part, deer sinew, you're good to go. Now if you use something like a bison sinew, and I have one here from the last bison that I shot, it's just naturally more greasy overall, and so you're going to actually want to wash it really, really well. And even something in primitive times where you just wash it in wood ashes, that can cut down a lot of the grease. I guess I should note, especially while that's starting to soften up, bison sinew looks like it's awesome to use, and I've now made a few bison sinew strings from my bison plus other bison as well. One thing that at least I've noticed, and I don't have any side-by-side comparison as far as break strength, but what I've gathered from my experiences, believe it or not, we would always say, man, bison sinew is probably way tougher, and although it is a bit longer, pound for pound, I truly believe that deer or elk sinew is significantly stronger, because as some of the first strings that I made with bison sinew, they tend to want to pull apart a little bit easier. And you'll notice when you take a piece of bison and you split it up, some of those you can actually pop with your hands, as opposed to you can grab a piece of deer sinew and you can't really pop it. It's much, much tougher. And so when we say, well, man, look at the size of the animal, that's ridiculous, how could that be? Well, man, just think about the legs that are on a deer and the amount of meat in its hindquarters, and that animal is just meant to jump. And for pound for pound, the abuse that its tendons must go through on a daily basis compared to a bison, although strong and can run fast, their bodies are just simply built differently. So I believe, deer, elk, moose is probably phenomenal as well, is going to be better than your bovine species, bison or cattle. But that being said, bison does actually work really, really well too. You just got to make it a tad bit thicker. But if I really had my choice, not having worked moose, can't really weigh in on that, but elk sinew without a doubt would be my #1 choice for making bowstrings, because you can take somewhere between 2 and 3 strips of back sinew from an elk, and it makes a phenomenal bowstring. Alright, so what we'll do is we'll pull you in a little bit closer so you can see me making this string, and then I'm just going to continue to talk to you and just pass on whatever knowledge I possibly can about primitive bowstrings in general, and then I'll be stopping once in a while to show you what I'm doing and why I'm doing it that way. Alright, the sinew's really only been soaking for about 5 minutes, not very long at all. I'll keep the water there in case I need it, but I don't want this super, super supple, because 1, it gets a little bit difficult to twist, and 2, it swells up a lot more. So if we just keep it mostly wet but not completely soaked and saturated, we'll get a better idea on what we're looking for in regards to the size. Okay, I always take a test bundle, a bunch of it. It always takes a bunch to get started, and then I twist it. And this is one of those things where I would like to say you're probably going to be shooting for 1/8 to 3/16 per bundle. Okay, now this just takes practice, and you're going to have to kind of figure it out and do a few till you know what you're really looking for. But there's always a little bit of a gamble to this, because as this sinew not only stretches, we're going to hang weight from it to dry, but as it stretches and it dries, it's going to shrink a very considerable amount. Now, that all being said, I've got 2 bows here, and I've killed animals with both of these bows. Okay, and when I measure these strings, this one's a little bit on the thinner side. It's about 1/8 of an inch thick finished out. This one is on my bison hunting bow, and it is about 3/16 of an inch finished out, and I have done them a little bit thicker than this as well, and still perfectly fine. In the book, this is something that I plan on doing more tests on in the future, just to be 100% positive, but we did a lot of testing in the book that the size difference, the thickness of the sinew string, makes a lot less difference in bow and arrow efficiency than you think. So practical thinking is a thinner bowstring is going to shoot much, much faster. A thinner bowstring is more noisy, without a doubt, and it does feel like it's got more shock. However, when we were shooting side-by-side tests with the same bow with different diameter bowstrings, the feet per second was within 1 to 2 feet per second for every primitive string that we used across the board. So that being said, if you make a very, very thin sinew string, you're probably not going to get a tremendous amount of performance out of it, but what you are going to get is a lot more noise and more chance of it wearing out and breaking. So for me, I always prefer to simply shoot a little bit thicker strings. Better to be safe than sorry. I do not want to be in the middle of a hunt and have my string blow apart on me. Now I have not, that all being said, and I'm going to get to the building part here, but this is really important. Sinew, the reason that I use Sinew first and foremost is that Sinew is really tough, it's really strong, and it doesn't have as many problems as many people think that it does, and we'll discuss that stuff a little bit more in the future. But Sinew by far has been the best. It meets all the performance that I'm looking for, especially compared to plant fiber strings, but Sinew strings very rarely wear out, very rarely. So I've had the same Sinew strings for a very long time, and I cannot say the same about plant fiber. But let's talk about all that stuff a little bit more in the future. Okay, so now what I'm doing with these two bundles is I want to kind of stack. I don't want them all perfect where the ends all start and stop at the same time. So if you've sat here and watched me, you've seen me pulling strips in and out to get different lengths, okay, and I've done that so where the ends, see how on this side a lot of the ends kind of stop all at the same spot, but on this side they're all different. That's what I'm trying to do overall, and in fact some of these are too many of these are facing the same direction, so I'm going to flip some of them around and then offset them even more, because I don't want any places ideally that just hit an abrupt stop and I have to build up a big spot to make up for it. I want these to just slowly and naturally, as I'm twisting the string, run out, and that's when I add a new one. You don't, if they all come off at once, now you've just created a weak spot. Okay, so that's why I do that the way that I do it. Now, with all that sorted out, well, of course now I'm monkeyed with it, so I gotta get it again. I want to offset these when I start this loop. And this is the top loop of the bowstring. Again, I don't want to start them even. What I want to do is take one side and pull it further than the other side. And the reason for that is, again, so when one side, when we bring the bundles together, which you'll understand in a little bit, when we twist this up, which I'm going to start doing, when we bring them together, some of these run out first. So if this is going to be all on one side, again, they're not all stopping at one time, okay? I think it'll make more sense as we go. And if you need to back that up and try to make sense of that again, go for it. Okay, so now it's just a simple cordage twist. If you do not know what a simple cordage twist is, you're not really ready to make a Sinew bowstring anyway. And I can drop a link down to Yucca Cord that I explain the cordage twist. But you really, really need to watch that video first, just to have an understanding of how the cordage twist really works. So what I'm doing now is I'm making the first bundle, and what you'll notice is that that is significantly thicker than what you would expect the finished bowstring to be, and it just simply has to be this way. This is why a little bit sometimes a gamble, because you don't know what you're going to get with or end up with by the time you're totally done making your bowstring. Okay, so I twisted about that much out. However much that much is, whatever you want your loop to be, make it smaller than you think you need it, because this thing is going to stretch and extend your loop. So what I typically like to do is make it just so I can get my finger into the loop, so this way when it stretches out to a normal sized loop. Okay, now I'm going to separate, I'm trying to find and separate these fibers, and you want to make sure that one side typically has some of your short fibers and some has your long fibers. So take the side that has your more long fibers and put it to the side that has the short fibers on the other side. So now you can see that these all kind of come and for the most part start tapering out here, but instead of having all the short ones just end right here, everything kind of tapers out nice and easy as we go. So you see how I've got my finger in here, and I'm going to put a couple really good tight twists in there. Now see, I've got a piece that's out, so I'm going to fix that quick. There we go. And although that loop looks relatively small right now, and see what I'm doing is I'm twisting that together. When this thing stretches, and you see how thick that is too, all that's gonna shrink out when we stretch this and dry it. But that loop is now gonna grow probably almost twice the amount that we want it to. And that's why we make it smaller to begin with. Okay, so now all we did was twist these together, and now you can see we're starting to run, some of the little fibers are starting to run out rather quickly, which is good because we don't want the whole string to be twice as thick. So we're looking pretty good there. And occasionally, like on this one, I have some fibers. I don't often recommend doing this, but one bundle is starting to feel thicker than the other. You can actually rob, and I don't normally recommend doing this in the middle of the string, but you can do it up here where it's doubled up. Rob some of the fibers, take probably some of your longer ones to even everything out, and actually shift them to the other bundle, and it'll make your cord look a little bit funny if you look at it up close, but you'll probably never notice, and either will anybody else, and you still have plenty of meat in here that you can get away with doing that. So what I did was I just evened up my bundles because one had more in it than the other side. Now, this just takes practice to figure out how much sinew you need. But when it starts feeling a little bit thin to me, I reach down and I grab one or two more pieces, and then I lay it in. Now, I'm going to show you that splice here in a second once I get down a little bit further. But at this point, you can even bring some up and set it on your lap so you don't have to keep bending over. And once I get down here just a little bit further, I will show you about the thickness I'm shooting for, and then you want to try to maintain that thickness throughout the rest of the string. Alright, almost there, and then I'll show you adding another one in right here. So to add them in, I've seen a lot of people do it different ways, where they take a little piece, lay it on one side, and then lay it long the rest of the way. I've tried that multiple times, and I don't love it. I've seen where people just lay them in like this and continue to twist them, and I'll show you that again, to where they'll just lay it in on one side and continue to twist it. And I've tried that too, and that can work with some success. But to make the strongest, most reliable string that I've ever put together, I literally split the fiber in half every single time. This way it's not pulling, it can't pull and pull this fiber just out of the rest of the string. It is literally turned over and twisted into the other side. So that makes a very, very strong sinew string that does not want to pull apart. Okay, sometimes I'll add, if I start feeling like I'm thinning out, I'll add two, and I also don't mind offsetting them a little bit so I get, again, they're not stopping all at the same spot when they run out. So I'm almost constantly twisting and adding another one. And I get one or two or three twists in, and I'm ready to add another one. And you want your string to just simply be as consistent as it can possibly be. Now, if you twist a little bit and it gets a little bit thin, you probably didn't see that, but I backed it back off. Don't be afraid to just untwist a couple twists. What I'll do is I'll twist down, because I can feel it now, it's getting too thin. I can feel it's a little bit too thin, so what I do is I just untwist a couple, and then I pinch it back off with my finger, and then I lay the new one in where I can feel that it's the thickness that I'm looking for. Again, I did about three twists or so. And you can also look at your bundles on either side. And if one is longer or just has more thick ends, take the thick end of the sinew and put it on the other side. Or if you have a lot of short ones on one side, you don't have to split it 50-50 in the center. You can take it and offset it and do maybe a quarter on this side and 3/4 on that side. But just plan ahead. I like to split it 50-50 if I can, but if I need to make up for run out on one side or the other, I'll just offset the sinew so it helps to catch up on the next round, if that makes sense. So I'm constantly planning while I'm twisting the string. But you can kind of see how fast it goes. It's pretty quick overall. I'll lay another piece in, and I'm twisting that in. And these are nice tight twists. I know it looks like I'm doing it fast, and I am, but you have to remember I've done dozens and dozens of sinew strings at this point, like many dozens, and thousands of feet of cordage, and that I can absolutely put numbers to because I know how many bows I've made, I know how many bowstrings I've made, and then I also know how many feet of cord I've made for gator hunting, and how many feet of cord I've made for net making, and for neck knife necklaces, and all kinds of stuff, and I've got thousands of feet of cordage under my belt at this point, so I am relatively quick. So it's probably not going to be as quick for you. Now, I don't mind some of these little tail ends sticking out because we're going to trim those off later. So once I get down to a little bit sticking out, I'm not trying to tuck every teeny tiny piece in because we're just going to trim those off later. Okay, just work on getting your twists nice and tight, and don't get too close the end of your runouts without splicing some in. Even if you still feel like you've got plenty of thickness, it's okay to make it a tad thicker in one spot if you think that a lot of your pieces are going to run out at one spot, because that'll be a weak point that this could either come apart while it's drying or break while you're shooting it. But typically, once you've hung weight from it and it's dried with weight hanging from it, it's much stronger and it's probably not going to break on you while you're shooting it, so long as you hung enough weight from it to begin with. Okay, so we're still motoring right along, and right now, let me take a measurement for you, and then I can give you, I know most people know I don't like tape measures because I like to just be intuitive, but I really want to teach you this. It's 5/16 is probably a good measurement to go. Good measurement to go with. Once this thing is all dried and stretched out, we'll measure it again, and then you'll have a little bit of an idea. But remember, the more you soak this stuff, the more it's going to swell, and the bigger differences you're going to see in your end diameter. But it's not really the end of the world if it's a little bit thick or a little bit thin. You just get a string where you like it, shoot it. And for folks that say you absolutely have to shoot a thin string or whatever, that couldn't be further from the truth, because this one right here, I've killed everything from rabbits to bison with it. And of course there's a lot more to it than just a string. But, you know, a relatively thick sinew string is definitely up to the task, I can promise you that. And all that being said, I definitely want to make mention that sinew strings, plant fiber strings as well, basically any primitive string is going to make your bow shoot significantly slower, shoot an arrow out of your bow significantly slower than a modern bowstring is. Okay, modern bowstrings have very, very little stretch, and they're very strong, so you can make very, very thin strings. And so the fact that they are very, very thin, and the fact that they have very little stretch to them, makes for a very efficient bowstring that makes your bow shoot fast. Now that's all well and good. If you want to shoot a modern bowstring because you want the speed out of it, go for it. But of course, as we know, modern bowstrings are not contextual. You know, they're not what early people had. They had sinew and plant fiber. So then I've also heard folks say, well, a plant fiber string won't stretch as much as a sinew string. This is all speculation and theory that people throw out, and I've heard a lot of it, and we talk about it in great detail in the book, that a plant fiber string doesn't stretch as much as sinew, so therefore a sinew string will be slower than a plant fiber string. Well, I thought that was very plausibly the case as well, and we did a lot of testing with yucca, some dogbane, and quite a bit of nettles as well. And those are, now I can't really comment on flax because flax doesn't grow here naturally, and therefore I didn't include it into my book, because my book is more about North American materials. So we stuck with what we had naturally in America, what we could put our hands on. Okay, so all that being said, the plant fiber strings in the book and all the tests we did, and this was not just one or two tests where it just was anomaly, this was something that we tested over and over on several different bows with several different strings, and what we got was it didn't matter if we shot yucca or nettles or rawhide or sinew, the speed of the arrow was almost identical within 1 to 2 feet per second of every other string that we shot. So essentially, and there was no conclusive pattern either. It wasn't that, you know, yucca consistently shot 1 foot per second faster than sinew, because there was times, and this is where the human element comes into it, there were times that the sinew string might have been 1 foot per second faster, and then there were other times that the yucca string was 1 foot per second faster, or, you know, the nettle string. So there was no real rhyme or reason to it, and after learning all of that information, it started to come down to longevity. So now it's easier to find large amounts of plant fiber, unless you're in wintertime, of course, in a cold climate. But here in Florida, you could find yucca any time of year, and you can find it in great quantities. And so I thought, man, that's really handy, because sinew is such a valuable resource in the primitive world, because it's used for lashing on feathers and blades and points, and there's so many good uses for it that if I could find a better use for a bowstring, a better material for a bowstring that save the sinew, then I would absolutely love to do that. So we made a lot of plant fiber strings, and we tried 2-ply and even 3-ply, and you can read all about it in the book. There's a ton more information than I'm able to really tell you in this video, but the plant fiber strings always cut themselves. It didn't matter what knot we used. If the knot would hold, then the string would eventually cut itself. And after a weekend of hunting, more times than not, see, I'm backing that off. I think I'm getting a little bit thin, so I'm going to back off and add some fibers in a little higher. After a weekend of hunting, I was starting to have multiple strings cutting and breaking. Okay, now some of them lasted longer than others, and it wasn't necessarily a material. It was probably just the bow it was being used on, who knows. And that was also utilizing a grease or a lubrication on the string, where we actually coated the string before we ever tied a knot to help cut down on abrasion, and we were still cutting the bowstring even with a lubrication on it. And anybody else that's done the test, that same test as well, like Joe McConnell's tested it pretty extensively alongside me, he agrees the same issue, that these plant fiber strings, although they make a good string, now they don't have any more performance than a sinew string at all, because the sinew doesn't really stretch, and we'll talk about that in a little bit too. But the plant fiber string does cut itself over time, and I did promise that after I did the yucca bowstring video that I would come back and I would give more proper feedback once I knew more. And now I do know more, so this is me basically saying yucca makes a fine bowstring, but it will not make a bowstring that lasts terribly long. Alright, so we're getting quite a bit of string now worked up, which is good, and I'm keeping it nice and consistent, nice and uniform. So we're just going to keep twisting it out. This would be another great time to talk about the stretching in sinew. Now, we're going to pre-stretch this and hang it basically from a bucket with weight in it. And that could be easily duplicated in early times by simply taking a rawhide bag or a brain tan bag and putting rocks in it and suspending your string, or suspending that bag with the rocks to stretch out the string while it dries. Once you take the stretch out of it and it dries, there's very little stretch, not compared to modern materials, of course. You can still feel the stretch compared to modern materials, but there's not a lot of stretch overall. It's very comparable to plant fiber at that stage, because when we make the yucca string or the nettle string, I actually do it the same way, where I twist it up while it's still green and hang weight from it to take the stretch out of it and let it dry that way. And even when you shoot it and you pull the string back, you can feel that there's a little bit of stretch in it, especially if you're used to shooting modern strings. So the Sinew doesn't actually stretch anymore. I can leave it strung all day long, and it might fluctuate 1/4 of an inch, even if it's moist out. So I've hunted with it in the dew of the morning, where it's been a very heavy dew or it's really humid, and I was terrified that my string was going to just get moisture on it and that it was going to stretch and I was going to lose brace height. And we quickly put all of that worry to bed that doesn't happen. Once we pre-stretch it, that doesn't happen at all. We hunt absolutely all day and have really no change in the string. I am no longer the least bit concerned, and I even bow fish and get these strings wet, and I'm not even concerned with string stretch then, because especially for the book that I wanted to have a lot of information on bowstrings, we quite literally took a Sinew bowstring and put it on a bow. It was braced. It wasn't just laying there. It was actually strung up. And I put a grease finish. That's what's on these ones here. There's a finish, or not a finish, like a sealer. And it doesn't hurt to reseal it up after a while if you know you're going to be in the wet weather. It's a animal grease and pine pitch blend, and it's the same stuff that I use in my bow finish video. So if you look up Hunt Primitive bow finish, you'll see that same bow finish for water sealant, and I use it on the string as well. And we quite literally strung up a bow, an Osage bow, and left it in the pouring down rain, laying in a puddle for 4 hours during the monsoon season. And I think we only lost something like 2 feet per second, and there was very little. There was, I think, 1/2 inch of stretch, putting it through that much abuse. And it's also important to note that when we repeated the test and left the bow unstrung, because when the string is relaxed like this, it's able to take in more moisture between the fibers. That's when we actually got more stretch and loss of power, because the string was really well saturated, and then we strung the bow up. Now the string still stuck together. It didn't come apart, but we did lose a little bit more performance that way. So the best thing that you can do, besides sealing your bowstring, which only really causes like a loss of 1 feet per second. We did that test as well. It doesn't add a ton of mass to the bowstring, and it's well worth it if you don't ever have to worry about it again. But if you get caught in the rain with a Sinew bowstring, you simply leave your bow strung, which sounds opposite of everything that most people would tell you, because it sounds like, man, if you get in the rain, you should unstring your bow or it's gonna suffer damage. Well, if it's got a good primitive sealer on the bow and a good primitive sealer on the string, the best thing you can do is leave it strung, because it keeps the fibers of the string really tight and it blocks out the water. So now that I know all of that, I have no issues whatsoever hunting in rainy weather with a Sinew bowstring. And all of this now I feel so confident in, not only because of the book and running all the tests that we did, and we did all these tests at home before we even tested them out in the field, but it has now been, I think, over 2 years since I have personally used a modern bowstring on any of my personal bows. I have stuck to using primitive strings of one type or another, and I no longer, this is the part that I'm very, very happy to share with you now, and even want to look at the camera to say it, is I no longer even carry a modern bowstring with me when I go hunt. I'm 100% dedicated to the primitive bowstring, so much so that I don't even bring a backup modern string anymore, and I no longer shoot a modern string and under any circumstances on a primitive bow, because I have that much confidence in the primitive string. Now keep in mind, remember, there are performance losses, and therefore your bow needs to be pretty, well performing, and your arrows also need to be optimized just as we describe in the book. Very, very important stuff. There's so that's why I'm saying all of this stuff really works together well in the book. There's so much more than just, you know, primitive strings or, you know, this is how you do this. All this stuff plays into each other to help make your set better overall. But all that being said, now I have no issue at all exclusively hunting with primitive strings, and realistically at this point I am 100% team Sinew string, and I have no interest in shooting the plant fiber strings anymore unless it's a survival situation and I just simply need a string and I don't have Sinew. Then I'll shoot the plant fiber. But I bow fish with the Sinew string, and I hunt in wet weather, and I have all the confidence in the world with it now, and I've killed several animals. Like I said before, I've killed everything from bunnies to bison with a Sinew bowstring. So I'm 100% team Sinew at this point. It is vastly superior, in my opinion, to plant fiber strings, mainly because of the longevity. Okay, so now I think I'm done. I'm gonna check my lengths. I used up my Sinew, and this bow is a little bit shorter, so I was making a shorter string anyway, but if it was a little bit longer bow, I'd probably do one more piece of back Sinew. But let me back the camera up here. We'll kind of measure it out and see where we're at. Okay, so I'm going to drop the loop end on the ground, and I'm going to stand on it, just the end, and then I'm going to pull up just a little bit, and I want to see how far this is going to stretch. And it's not quite as tall as me, but the bow that I'm building this for a customer is quite a bit shorter. Okay, in fact, here is the bow itself. So what I'm going to do is, you can see that I've got, right just about out of the frame here, I've got more string than I need for the bow, and I'm actually standing on the loop and the tip of the bow is on my foot, so I have quite a bit of space here. Now if this was as long as it was and it turned over and this was dry, I would be a little uncomfortable with it because I don't have a lot of room to tie a knot. However, the string's going to be shorter than the bow anyway, because that's what's going to give it brace, and when we hang weight from this, it's going to stretch the string. So that is fine. What you really want, ideally, is if you can stretch that string, you probably want your string, just to be safe, to be about 6 inches longer than your bow before you ever even stretch it. And the reason for that is because even though we've got plenty of room, we're going to tie a knot in this to suspend weight from it, and a lot of times at the end it's a little easier just to cut the knot than try to undo it, so you can sacrifice a little bit of that Sinew, and then you take the piece that you cut off, throw it in your Sinew pile for making glue later, because you don't want to waste this stuff. But you're also going to have to tie a bow line or a bow line bowline, however you want to, 3 different ways to pronounce the dang knot that everybody says it different, and then they want to argue with me that this is how you say it. So bow line, bow line, or bowline, okay? You're going to tie that in when you put it on your bow. So now that we've got the string done, let's just go ahead and we'll head outside and we'll hang it up. Alright, we're out here in the work barn, and I'm going to take my skinning gambrel down, use my block and tackle system, and we're going to hang it up from this. However, I'm going to tie a very short, little quick bowline knot at the bottom. And if you don't know what that is, just look it up. I want to save as much of this string as possible. And if I have to undo the knot later, that's fine too. I tie that knot so I can take it out, and this is a non-slip knot. Keep in mind though that your Sinew is a little bit wet, so it will slip a little bit. I'm going to feed that under the handle of my bucket that's got weight in it, and then back through the knot that I just tied. Okay, and then I'm going to loop that onto the skinning gambrel. Now I've got 60 pounds of weight in the bucket, but I just want to start with 30 for right now. And I'm also going to take a rope, just a little piece of string, and I got a post over here, and I'm just going to tie this to the bucket, but I'm not going to tie it to the post yet, and I'll explain what I'm doing here in a second. And we're going to put some tension on this. Now twist it so you know which direction. If you spin this bucket, it's going to tighten the string one way, and if you spin it the other way, it's going to untwist it, and we certainly don't want it to do that. So before I ever lift it up, I want to know that the bucket's got to swing. Now, to me, it's clockwise. When I pick the bucket up, it's going to want to swing counterclockwise. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and put a few turns on it, and we're going to see. I don't want to twist the crap out of it, but maybe a dozen turns. Then I'm going to hold on to the rope with one hand, and I'm going to lift the block and tackle up a little bit higher so it's got room to stretch, and then I'm going to go tie this off on my cleat over here. Alright, we're tied off there, and now if you just let this go, it's going to unspin the bucket. So that's what this rope's for. Like, whoops. Shouldn't be up that high because now it is just spinning. You got to put it down low by the where it connects, and then tie that off to your post, and that'll keep it from untwisting. And remember, all this could be done with a bag, a rawhide or a brain tan bag, and we're going to let this kind of sit with about 30 pounds on it for maybe 15 or 20 minutes, because if you put too much weight on it too fast, you can potentially have some problems that it'll separate the fibers and break. And if it separates the fiber and it breaks, then now you got to untwist all that mess and retwist it. Now, for the most part, we're probably safe to just put all 60 pounds in there right now and it would be perfectly fine. However, after doing this a few times and having it occasionally pull apart, I've learned to do it incrementally. So we're just going to let that hang out there till it loses a little bit of moisture and it gets tacky. Okay, so all the natural glues that are in the Sinew, that's one of the reasons that we love to use Sinew to make glue, which again is a different video for a different day coming up soon, so make sure you're following along for that. But as that Sinew starts to dry, it gets very tacky and it sticks to itself really well. So we're going to have plenty of time to add more weight to this, but I'm going to come back and, like I said, a half an hour or an hour, and I'll drop the other 30 pounds in the bucket. You don't even need to be here to watch that. But then this thing's going to sit until tomorrow, and then tomorrow we'll be ready to take it down, trim up the edges, and we'll finish it out. And now is also a great time to check the length of your string one more time to be sure. Now remember, it's not fully stretched yet. We just hung it. But take the bow that it's going to go on and put the tip of the bow up by where the loop is, and the bottom knock, you need a bare minimum of the full length of your bow, because remember, you have to tie a knot in here. So this one's going to be perfect because this one is about 2 inches longer than the overall length of the bow, and that will give us a little bit of slack without a ton of waste that we can tie our knot, which will come up to about here when it's all said and done, and we'll have a little pigtail. We shouldn't even have to unwind that knot. What we do is, like, I have one here too. Here's an old knot that I cut. Here's an old knot that I cut. You can't see them, it's too far. But when I'm getting ready to make glue, I come over to my bucket and I take a knife and I cut all those knots off, because that's good sinew, and I stick it down in my glue pot, and then we use it to make the glue. So make sure you check that one last time to make sure that your length is good. It's perfectly fine to have an extra long string. Always shoot for a little extra long and be able to cut a little bit off, as opposed to get your string done and go, oh crap, I don't have enough room to tie a knot anymore. Alright, well, we took the string down this morning and it shrunk up about like I expect, to about 3/16 of an inch, which is really about perfect for the bow that I'm fixing to put it on, because it's 67 pounds at 23 inches. So I want a respectably stout string. So this one's done except for tying it on. So that's pretty self-explanatory, but I'll go ahead and hook the loop in the top limb and pull it kind of tight. And then I'm going to come down all about where I'm wanting the loop to be. And you're probably going to have to tie this a few times, and I'll do a close-up to show you the knot here in a second. But you'll probably have to tie this a few times until you get the length that you're looking for. So you can twist up a little bit to tighten, but with these Sinew strings are already kind of twisted up with the cords twist the whole way. So it's not going to be like a Dacron string, a modern string, where you can put 12 or 15 twists in it and then take 10 or 15 twists out of it. So you're going to have to try to tie it to the length that you want it the first time, but that takes a little bit of practice. And that's another reason you use the bow line, because you can always pick that knot and get it loose and it doesn't slip. And then you can just move your knot up a little bit, tie it again until you get the brace height you're looking for. Alright, we'll try to do an over the shoulder, at least just to show you how to loosely do the knot. So I make one loop overhand, so it comes back over the top of the string. Then you're going to go up through the hole, around the back of the string, and back through that hole. And then when you pulled all this tight, this will be your bottom loop. We strung the bow up, took a couple test shots, looks really good. Now you still got a little piece left over here. We can just trim that if you want. I always say leave just a little bit just in case you have to wiggle something around. But once it's set, it's typically pretty set. You don't have to untie it again. I would say shoot it a little bit first to make sure that your string really settles in before you go trim it, in case you do have to make a couple adjustments. Now, there's a whole bunch of these little tag end pieces, and they are super easy to clip off. So if you got a couple options here. If you want to do it the real primitive way, do it while the bow is strung. Just be careful you don't cut the string. Pull a piece out and then hit it with a stone flake, and you'll knock that right off. Or come along and take a pair of scissors and clip them, or even fingernail clippers work very, very good. So I'm going to go ahead and just clip all the little tag ends off the string. That way we're completely done, and then this Hunt primitive bow is ready to ship off to the customer. So remember that you do also have the option to put a sealer on the string, especially if you're going to be hunting in a lot of wet weather. Usually leave that up to the customer if they want to do that or not. I really like the looks of natural Sinew, but when it comes to function, putting that sealer on it does really help. But that's the same exact sealer, like I said, that's in my bow finish video, which is an animal grease and pine pitch blend. Either way, that way you can coat the bow, you can coat the string, and you're good to go. Alright guys, thanks for following along. Hopefully you learned a lot about primitive strings in general, and specifically Sinew strings. Hopefully you're able to follow along and build your very own Sinew string for hunting. And if not, remember you can always check out huntprimitive.com. And the best thing about primitive archery is you can purchase things along the way if you need them while you're on your journey of learning how to make your own bows, arrows, stone points, primitive strings, you name it. And of course I'm here to help you in any way possible, whether it's through the video or through the website selling either materials or finished product. But either way, we want to get you out into the woods and really put you where you want to be in your own primitive archery or primitive hunting adventure. So until next time, thanks for sticking with us and hope you learned a lot. We'll catch you on the next one.